Are off-market deals better? I get to ask this question pretty frequently from investors, and today I'm going to tell you about my experience with off-market sellers and a couple of things that can be a benefit and also a drawback to pursuing off-market deals. So basically, when you are pursuing a seller and asking them if they want to sell before they've made a public commitment to put their property on the market, like what a traditional on market listing is, the sellers are in three different categories. The first one would be the type of person who says, if you call them up and ask them if they're willing to sell, they would say, everything's for sale. What offer will you make me? And these are the folks who take the mentality that they're always willing to sell. It's just a matter of what number. But typically their number's going to be pretty high, and most people are not going to want to pay it. So those are the type of folks who are open and receptive, but usually are not really anything's going to happen because the seller's going to want too much money. The second type of person are the immediate no's. And these are the type of people who will buy something and hold on to it for 40 years. They're just the mentality, they're going to buy it and hold it until they die. And oftentimes there's not really much to be had there, and they get very annoyed of you contacting them. But I've also found the opposite. Sometimes you'll reach someone who says, yeah, I'll sell my property, and it seems like what they want is reasonable. But I've learned from unfortunate experience that oftentimes this situation is something where your red flag should go up, and you should be very cautious because there's usually a reason for that. If you have someone who's a motivated seller, but they're not actually putting their property on the market, there's usually a reason that they might be having an issue, or maybe there's a judgment against them, or something in their personal life going on. So it's just something to be very careful about if you happen to get someone who seems like they're an immediate yes at a really good price. Just be careful with that. The third type of person is someone who may consider selling and is a genuine seller at what may be a reasonable price. But usually the timing is not right, or you just need to stay in continual contact with them until it is the right time for them. So an example of this would be a longtime owner who is getting up in years and they're ready to consider selling their property because they're really tired of dealing with tenants and taking care of maintenance and all those things, but they just haven't quite reached the point in their mind where they're ready to part with their investment, because oftentimes there's a lot of emotional commitment to it if they've held that investment for a long time. So that type of seller may be someone who you just need to stay with for a long time until they get to a point where they're ready to part with the investment. Now, there's a couple of benefits to purchasing an off-market property, and these benefits would be primarily for the buyer. That would be less competition, number one, because obviously if you don't have to compete with other buyers, you're likely going to get a better deal and be able to negotiate. Of course, is why everyone thinks off-market deals are the better choice. But just be aware that if they're talking to you, that probably means they're also talking to other people. So it doesn't mean you're the only buyer. It just means there's probably less competition than if the property was being publicly marketed for sale. So I've had multiple situations where I've talked to sellers who said, yeah, I might sell in the next couple of years. And I've stayed in touch with them, and they'll say, yeah, so-and-so called me, or I'm talking to this person about selling. And they'll usually engage with multiple people at the same time if they are at a point where they're thinking about making a decision. So just don't delude yourself that if they're talking to you, that they're the only person that they're talking to. Another benefit would be more flexibility on terms, because typically if you're in a very competitive situation, you might have to offer cash, you might have to decrease your contingencies or eliminate them altogether. So having the ability to negotiate some terms that are more favorable on your behalf is certainly a big benefit of purchasing an off-market property. And the third benefit may be a better price. Now, of course, they say maybe because oftentimes I find that people who are entertaining off-market deals may be doing so just because they're the seller type number one, where they're like, hey, everything's for sale, it's just the right number, or I'll sell if I get my number. And so sometimes they're not always the best deals, but if it's something that makes sense to you, it could be a good deal. And here's a couple of drawbacks that you may need to consider as well. It can take a lot of time to nurture and find those relationships. So for the seller who's thinking about retiring from being a landlord, it may take some time to come to the point where they're ready to take that big step. And finding that person and then nurturing that relationship over a time period of multiple years, that can be a big time commitment. And either you or someone on your team would need to be able to have the continuity to continue to follow up with that person and the time commitment to be able to do that. So just make sure that you're aware of that if you're going to go after those off-market deals. The second drawback could be that you need to educate that seller as well. So for example, I was talking to a gentleman who was willing to sell his property, but he was going to do it himself. He didn't need help. But I just began sharing some of my experience as a broker with him in recent sales. And of course, insurance in multifamily properties has become a lot more stringent and a lot more expensive in the last couple of years. So I shared with him the experience that a lot of the properties that we were seeing be sold, the insurance provider was requiring any panels that might be Zinsco or outdated electrical panels be replaced before they'd even consider insuring it. Or if you could find a company to insure it, it would be at a much higher price. So I told the seller, if you have these outdated panels, you really do need to replace them if you expect to be able to market your property. And he actually was very receptive. He listened. He took care of having them all replaced, which was great. But oftentimes you will need to be the one to educate that seller about some of those market conditions, and then of course educating them about price and cap rates and what typical expenses are looking like. If they've self-managed for the past 40 years, what a management fee is going to be, and needing to incorporate that into your NOI. So just basic education requirements can take a lot of time and patience to make sure that you're doing that and kind of holding their hand through that process. The third drawback could be that you'd inherit a mess. And what I mean by this is I've had a lot of clients or people who are selling off market where the financials are just kind of a mess. They don't always know where their leases are. And so if you're working directly with a seller, you may be responsible for putting together that whole picture, helping them source their documents, figuring out what your rent roll and P&L actually looks like, because some sellers just are not organized. And if there's a broker involved, oftentimes if the broker's doing a good job, they're helping the seller to organize all that information. But if you're going directly to that client, you're the one who's probably going to help them clean that up and turn it into something organized and coherent. Those are some definite drawbacks as well as benefits to purchasing an off-market property. So in answer to the question, are off-market deals better? Well, they can be, but it all just depends. Are off-market deals better? I get to ask this question pretty frequently from investors, and today I'm going to tell you about my experience with off-market sellers and a couple of things that can be a benefit